The rain fell in sheets against the glass of the little cafe on Morrison Street, blurring the world outside into a watercolor wash of gray and neon. Inside it was warm, smelling of steamed milk and roasted coffee beans, a scent Julian had come to associate with a specific kind of heartache. It was the scent of the life he pretended to have. He watched Chloe from across their small, scarred wooden table, his hands loosely curled around a mug of tea he hadn't touched. The warmth did nothing to reach the cold that had settled deep in his bones centuries ago. She was tracing the rim of her own mug, a faint line of lipstick left behind on the white ceramic. Her brow was furrowed in a way that was so familiar it felt like a part of his own anatomy. It was her "world is unjust" furrow, the one that appeared when her favorite bakery was out of almond croissants, or when she talked about the state of her love life. Today it was the latter. It's a wasteland, Jules. A complete and utter post-apocalyptic wasteland of emotionally unavailable men who think ghosting is a communication style, she sighed, the sound getting lost in the gentle hiss of the espresso machine. I swear I'm going to die alone, probably choked on a piece of takeout pizza, and my cat will eat my face before anyone finds me. Julian offered a smile. It was a practiced thing, a carefully constructed expression of sympathetic amusement he had perfected over the last 5 years. It was one of 1,000 masks he wore for her, for this world. Inside, her words were like tiny, sharp stones pelting against his ribs. Alone. The thought of her alone was a physical agony, a tearing sensation in the vicinity of a heart that no longer beat. He was the king of a lightless, lonely kingdom, and the irony was so bitter it could curdle blood. I highly doubt Mr. Whiskers has it in him, he said, his voice a low, smooth cadence he consciously softened for human ears. He's far too fond of your chin scratches. Chloe didn't return the smile. She just looked at him, her eyes, the color of warm honey and just as sweet, filled with a genuine, weary frustration. I'm serious. What's wrong with me? Am I putting out some kind of vibe? A please break my heart and leave your socks on my floor pheromone. Everything was wrong with them, not her. The men she met were fragile, fleeting creatures of sunlight and fleeting passions. They couldn't possibly comprehend the depths within her, the loyalty that ran like a river of gold, the fierce intelligence that sparked behind her easy laughter. They were boys playing with matches next to a carefully contained inferno. He, on the other hand, understood fire. He was born of shadow and flame. And that was precisely the problem. He could give her a world of breathless devotion. He could give her millennia of adoration, lay empires at her feet, rewrite the stars to spell her name. But his world was a place of ancient laws and eternal night, of blood debts and violent power. It was a gilded cage, and she was meant for the sun. To love her was to protect her, and to protect her was to stay just like this. Her best friend, the quiet, vaguely eccentric art history consultant with an old family fortune and a listening ear. There is nothing wrong with you, Chloe, he said, and the truth of it was a profound, aching thing. It was the most honest sentence he had spoken all day. He leaned forward, drawn into her orbit as he always was. The problem isn't you. It's them. They're unequipped. Unequipped? They're men, not IKEA furniture. She slumped back in her chair. I just want one. One decent guy who calls when he says he will, and doesn't think a thoughtful text is just a pizza emoji. An idea, terrible and brilliant, began to form in the silent, calculating part of his mind. It was a dangerous, selfish impulse dressed in the noble guise of helpfulness. He saw a path, a way to have what he couldn't, even if just for a little while. A way to touch, to teach, to shape, to be close to her in a way that friendship didn't quite allow. It was a loophole in his own rigid self-denial. Perhaps you're not packaging the product correctly, he offered, testing the waters. Her eyes narrowed. Are you calling me a product? I'm saying you have a Rolls-Royce engine, and you're letting men who can only handle a scooter take you for a test drive. You intimidate them. Your light is too bright." He let the words hang in the air, watching them land. He saw the flicker of pleasure in her eyes, the way she straightened slightly. "So I'm supposed to, what? Dim myself down?" "Never," he said, the word coming out with more force than he intended. He softened his tone again. "No. You simply need to learn how to introduce the light gradually so they don't flee from the glare. You need to learn their language, the art of the chase, the dance of it." She looked at him, a real curiosity dawning in her expression. "And you're an expert on this, are you? The great Julian Croft, who I've never seen on a date in the 5 years I've known him?" He had mastered the art of the hunt over more lifetimes than she could imagine. He had charmed princesses and seduced queens when the world was younger and more honest about its monsters. "I am a student of history," he said, a half-truth that was more true than she knew. "And history is nothing but a long, elaborate story of seduction and power. I watch. I observe. I understand the mechanics of desire." The idea was fully formed now, a beautiful, venomous flower blooming in his chest. "Let me help you," he said, the words feeling like a vow. "Let me be your consultant, your coach. We'll refine your approach. We'll prepare you for the wasteland." Chloe stared at him, her head tilted. The ambient noise of the cafe seemed to fade away, leaving only the two of them in a bubble of charged silence. He could feel the frantic, useless thump of his stilled heart, a phantom echo of a life long past. He was offering to teach her how to leave him. He was offering to orchestrate his own heartbreak. It was the most selfless and the most profoundly selfish thing he had ever done. "You want to coach me? In dating?" A slow smile spread across her face, hesitant at first, then wide and brilliant. It was like the sun breaking through the rain-streaked window. "You're completely insane." "Possibly," he agreed, his own smile feeling a little more real this time. "Okay," she said, leaning forward again, her eyes sparkling with a mixture of amusement and intrigue. "I'm in. Coach me, Jules. Teach me how to waltz with the wolves." He met her gaze, and for a moment the mask slipped. He let her see the briefest flicker of the ancient, possessive thing that lived behind his eyes. A wolf teaching a lamb how to survive in the forest, all the while knowing he was the most dangerous creature in it. "Gladly," he murmured. And the rain kept falling. The first lesson began not with words, but with silk. Julian insisted their campaign required a new arsenal, a wardrobe that spoke a language she wasn't yet fluent in. He took her to a part of the city she'd only ever seen from a taxi window, a street of quiet, elegant storefronts with single garments displayed in their windows like museum pieces. The air here was different, rarefied, smelling of money and leather. Chloe felt a nervous flutter in her stomach as Julian held the heavy glass door of a boutique open for her. The interior was hushed, all cream carpets and brushed gold fixtures. A woman with a severe haircut and an impeccably tailored suit glided toward them, her eyes flicking over Chloe's jeans and comfortable sweater with dismissive speed before landing on Julian. Her expression shifted instantly. "Mr. Croft," she said, her voice thawing. "A pleasure. We received the new season's collection this morning." "Isabel," Julian greeted her with a nod that was both casual and regal. "We'll require the main fitting room. And champagne." "We?" Chloe whispered as Isabel disappeared into the back. "There's a we?" "This is a collaborative process," he said, his eyes already scanning the racks of clothing. He moved with a languid grace that was mesmerizing to watch. He didn't browse, he assessed. His long fingers would ghost over a fabric, cashmere, satin, silk, his touch both reverent and clinical. He saw more than just clothes. He saw textures, lines, the way a shadow would fall in the hollow of a throat, the way a specific shade of blue would deepen the gold in her eyes. He pulled a dress from a rack. It was a slip of emerald green silk, so fluid it seemed almost alive as he held it up. "This," he said, his voice low and certain. "For a first impression. It doesn't shout. It whispers." In the fitting room, which was larger than Chloe's bedroom, she felt hopelessly out of her depth. The champagne sat untouched in a silver bucket. She slipped out of her own clothes, the familiar denim and cotton feeling clumsy and childish, and reached for the silk. It was cool and impossibly smooth against her skin, pooling around her feet. When she looked in the three-way mirror, she saw a stranger. The dress clung to her body not with tightness, but with a liquid weight, outlining her shape in a way that was both elegant and profoundly sensual. "Are you decent?" Julian's voice came from just outside the curtain. I think so." He didn't wait for a more certain answer. He pulled the heavy velvet curtain aside, and the breath caught in Chloe's throat. He wasn't looking at her face. His gaze started at the floor, at the way the silk hem brushed against her bare feet, and traveled slowly, deliberately, upward. It was a tangible thing, his attention, like a physical touch tracing the line of her calf, the curve of her hip, the gentle slope of her collarbone. By the time his eyes met hers in the mirror, her skin was humming, a strange heat blooming under its surface. He stepped into the fitting room, his presence shrinking the already generous space. He moved behind her, and she watched their reflection, her heart beginning a slow, heavy drumbeat against her ribs. He was so close she could feel the warmth radiating from his body, smell the faint, clean scent of bergamot and old books that always clung to him. "You see?" he murmured, his voice a low vibration just behind her ear. He reached out, his fingers not quite touching her, but hovering over the bare skin of her shoulder. The tiny hairs on her arms stood on end. "The fabric moves when you breathe. It suggests rather than reveals. It invites curiosity." He was talking about the dress. She knew he was talking about the dress. But the intensity in his dark eyes, the focused line of his mouth in the reflection, it felt like he was talking about her. Like he was seeing her, truly seeing her, for the first time. It was unnerving and thrilling all at once. He finally let his fingers make contact, resting them gently on her shoulder. His touch was cool, a stark contrast to the heat he'd ignited in her. The silk of the dress seemed to sigh under his hand. He adjusted the thin strap, his thumb brushing against her skin in a slow, deliberate motion that sent a shiver straight down her spine. "The color," he continued, his voice still quiet, intimate, meant only for her and their reflection. "It's the color of new leaves after a long winter. It speaks of life, of promise." Chloe couldn't find her voice. She could only stare at the man in the mirror, the man she thought she knew so well. The Julian who brought her soup when she was sick and helped her assemble furniture and listened to her endless romantic woes. This man was different. There was an ancient gravity to him, a predatory stillness in his posture that she had never noticed before. The way he looked at her, it was with the possessive appreciation of an artist appraising his masterpiece, or a king surveying his most prized treasure. He met her gaze in the mirror again, and this time there was no pretense. The carefully constructed friendly distance was gone, burned away by a raw, consuming fire in his eyes. It was a look of profound, desperate longing, so naked and so powerful it made her feel dizzy. It lasted only a second. Then, as if a switch had been flipped, he blinked and it was gone. The mask was back in place. He was just Julian, her friend, helping her pick out a dress. He stepped back, breaking the spell. The air rushed back into the small space, cool and thin. "It's perfect," he said, his voice once again calm and collected. "We'll take it. And the sapphire blue one. And the crimson velvet." Chloe stood frozen for a long moment after he had closed the curtain, her hand pressed to her shoulder where his fingers had been. The silk was cool against her skin, but she was burning from the inside out. This was supposed to be a lesson in attracting other men, but the only man she could think about was the one on the other side of the curtain. The wasteland suddenly seemed very far away. She had a feeling she had just stepped into a much more dangerous and infinitely more beautiful territory. The lessons continued, each one an exercise in exquisite torture for Julian. He taught her how to walk into a room, not just to enter it, but to claim it. "Your space begins 2 feet around you," he explained, his voice echoing slightly in the vast, empty ballroom of the city's oldest hotel, a place he'd rented for an afternoon under some vague pretense. "Occupy it. Do not apologize for the air you displace." He watched her practice, her steps growing more confident, her posture lengthening until she moved with the innate grace he'd always known she possessed. Each sway of her hips was a new, fresh torment. He taught her about wine, not just how to order it, but how to speak its language. He took her to a private cellar, its cool, damp air thick with the scent of earth and sleeping fruit. He showed her how to hold a glass by the stem, how to swirl the deep garnet liquid and watch the tears cling to the crystal. "Listen to what it tells you," he'd murmured, their heads bent close together over a glass of vintage Bordeaux. "The scent of leather, of tobacco, of dark cherries. It's a story. Learn to read it." She had looked up at him then, her lips parted, her eyes wide in the dim light, and all he could think about was the story his own ancient, thirsty blood was telling him. He taught her conversation, the art of asking questions that unspooled a person's soul, of listening to the pauses between words. They practiced in crowded restaurants, Julian pointing out a couple across the room. "Look at them," he'd say. "He is leaning in, she is mirroring his posture. He is captivated. But her eyes keep flicking toward the door. She is already gone." He was teaching her to see the invisible currents of desire that flowed between people, all while a tidal wave of his own was threatening to break the dam of his control. But the waltz was the most dangerous lesson of all. He had brought her back to the empty hotel ballroom one evening. The city lights twinkled like a fallen constellation through the towering, arched windows. He had brought a single, old-fashioned gramophone, and the sweet, scratchy notes of a lone violin filled the cavernous space. "This is the final lesson in non-verbal communication," he said, his voice unnaturally formal. "The waltz is a conversation, a negotiation of trust and control." Chloe stood in the center of the polished floor, wearing the emerald silk dress. She had insisted, saying she needed to feel the part. The sight of her, bathed in moonlight and the soft glow of the city, was so beautiful it was a physical pain. It was a vision he knew would be seared into his memory for the rest of his eternal existence. "I don't know how," she said, her voice small in the big room. "I will teach you," he promised. He walked toward her, his footsteps echoing on the marble. He stopped a breath away from her, and the air crackled with everything they had so carefully left unsaid for 5 years. He held out a hand. "May I?" She placed her hand in his. Her skin was warm, alive. His was cool, a constant reminder of the chasm between them. He drew her closer, his other hand finding the small of her back, the silk of the dress a maddeningly thin barrier. She rested her free hand on his shoulder, her fingers hesitant at first, then settling with a gentle pressure. They stood like that for a long moment, simply breathing, suspended in the music. The man leads, he said, his voice a low rumble that vibrated through her palm. But the woman decides if she will follow. It is her power to make his lead graceful. You are not passive in this, you are his partner. He began to move, a slow, simple box step. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. Chloe stumbled at first, her eyes fixed on their feet. Don't look down, he instructed gently. Look at me. Trust me. I won't let you fall. She lifted her head, her honey gold eyes locking with his, and the world fell away. There was only the music, the brush of her dress against his legs, the warmth of her hand in his, the scent of her skin, a faint, clean fragrance of Frisia and Chloe. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. Her body began to learn his, her steps anticipating his lead. She relaxed into his hold, a silent surrender that felt more intimate than any kiss. They moved across the floor, a solitary pair in a sea of moonlight and marble. He spun her out, her dress flaring around her like the petals of a flower, then drew her back in, her body flush against his. Her breath hitched, and he felt the tremor of it pass through him. He could feel the quick, frantic beat of her heart against his silent chest. It was the most beautiful and most tragic sound he had ever heard. The song swelled, the violin weeping a melody of longing and sorrow. He held her tighter, his carefully constructed control beginning to fray at the edges. This was a mistake, a terrible, wonderful mistake. He was holding everything he had ever wanted, teaching her how to dance with someone else. The selflessness of the act was a lie. This moment, right now, was for him. It was a memory he was stealing, a ghost of a life he could never have. He dipped her low, her back arching, her hair brushing against the cool floor. He held her there, suspended, her face turned up to his. Her lips were parted, her eyes dark and searching. The music swirled around them, a cocoon of sound. He could close the distance. He could brush his lips against hers, taste the life and warmth he craved, and damn the consequences. He could tell her everything, shatter the masquerade, and show her the monster who adored her. The violin played its final, mournful note, holding it until it faded into silence. The gramophone hissed softly. The spell was broken. With a strength of will that cost him more than he could ever explain, Julian slowly, gently brought her back to her feet. He released her, stepping back, putting a universe of cold air between them. The loss of her warmth was immediate and absolute. The lesson is over, he said, his voice hoarse. He turned away from her, unable to bear the look of dazed confusion on her face. He walked to the window, gripping the cold marble of the sill, and stared out at the city that was not his home. He had taught her how to dance. Now, all he could do was wait for another man to take his place in her arms. The flirting lesson was a descent into a very specific kind of hell. Julian chose a quiet corner in a dimly lit cocktail lounge, the kind of place where secrets were whispered over the clinking of ice in heavy crystal glasses. The air was thick with expensive perfume and the low thrum of jazz from a hidden speaker. It was the perfect stage for the delicate art of verbal seduction. He ordered them both martinis, though he had no intention of drinking his. He needed his senses sharp, his control absolute. "All right," Chloe said, setting her glass down with a soft click. She leaned forward, her eyes bright with a nervous energy. Lesson 5. Flirting. What's the first rule? The first rule was not to be in love with the person you were practicing on. The first rule was not to mean every single word you were about to say. The first rule, Julian said, his voice a low counterpoint to the saxophone's mournful melody, is that flirting is not about what you say. It's about creating a space for the other person to want more. It's about suggestion. It's about the spaces between the words. Okay, Professor Croft, give me an example. She took a sip of her drink, watching him over the rim of the glass. He held her gaze. Your eyes are the color of whiskey in the firelight. It's a shade of gold that could make a man forget his own name. Chloe blinked, a faint blush rising on her cheeks. She laughed, a slightly breathless sound. Okay, wow, that's direct. It's a statement of fact, he said, his expression unreadable. But it's too much, too soon. It's a closing line, not an opening one. You've left no space for curiosity. Let's try again. He paused, letting the silence stretch. You, on the other hand, should start with a question. Like, do you come here often? She asked, a playful smile on her lips. No, never that. That is a script. You need to be authentic. Observe something about them, something they've chosen. He gestured vaguely at his own dark suit. Ask about the book they're reading, the pin on their lapel, the unusual ring on their finger. It shows you're paying attention. It makes them feel seen. The irony was a physical weight in his chest. He saw everything about her. He saw the tiny, almost invisible scar above her left eyebrow from a childhood fall. He saw the way she chewed on her lower lip when she was concentrating. He saw the fierce, protective loyalty she gave so freely to the people she loved. He saw it all, and he had to pretend he saw nothing but a friend. Okay, my turn, she said, her confidence bolstered by the gin. She looked at him, her gaze analytical, a student trying to apply a lesson. She was quiet for a long moment, and he felt himself being catalogued, studied. That watch, she said finally, it's beautiful. It looks old. Does it have a story? His blood went cold. He hadn't thought she'd notice it. The watch was one of the few things he kept from his former life, a relic from a time before the shadows had claimed him. It was platinum, the face bare of numbers, its hands marking a time that no longer mattered. It didn't run on gears or batteries. It ran on something else entirely. It was my father's, he said, the lie tasting like ash on his tongue. He was his father, and his father's father. The watch was his. It had always been his. Oh, she said, her expression softening. I'm sorry, is that a sore subject? No, he said, forcing a detached tone. It's just a watch. He unclasped it and slid it across the smooth, dark wood of the table toward her. An old piece of machinery. She picked it up, her warm fingers closing around the cool metal. She turned it over in her palm, her touch gentle, reverent. There's an inscription on the back. She squinted in the low light. Tempus neminem manet. Time waits for no one, he translated, the words a hollow echo of a truth he had long since defied. Except you, maybe? She joked, looking up at him. You never seem to age. His carefully constructed composure fractured. For a terrifying second, he felt the glamour around him flicker, the human mask threatening to dissolve. He could feel the alien coldness in his own eyes, the unnatural stillness of his posture. He saw a flicker of confusion in her face, a momentary question, before she dismissed it, attributing his strangeness to the topic of his father. He reached across the table and gently took the watch from her hand, his fingers brushing against hers. The brief contact was like a spark of lightning on a humid night. He clasped it back around his wrist, hiding it beneath the cuff of his shirt. Back to the lesson, he said, his voice tighter than before. Eye contact. It is crucial. You hold their gaze just long enough to create a connection. Then you look away. It creates tension. A question. Did they imagine it? He demonstrated, looking directly into her eyes. He didn't let himself think. He let the raw, desperate truth of his feelings pour into that single look. He held it, pouring centuries of loneliness, of adoration, of silent, screaming devotion into that one channel. He saw her pupils dilate. He saw her breath catch in her throat. Her lips parted slightly. The air grew thick, heavy, charged with a voltage that was both terrifying and intoxicating. Then, as instructed, he looked away, down at his untouched drink, shattering the connection. The silence that followed was deafening. It was filled with the frantic beating of her heart, which she could hear as clearly as if it were his own. "I see," she finally whispered, her voice husky. "That's effective." "The final element is touch," he said, forcing himself to continue, to complete the self-flagellation. "A brief, seemingly accidental brush of fingers when you reach for a menu. A light touch on the arm to emphasize a point. It establishes intimacy. It breaks a physical barrier." He looked at her hand, resting on the table near his. "Like this." He reached out, every fiber of his being screaming in protest and in need. He slowly, deliberately, laid his hand over hers. Her skin was so warm, so alive. His was so cold. It was the entire story of them in a single touch. The living and the dead, the sun and the shadow. He felt a jolt, a current of life, of energy, flow into him from her touch. It was a drug, and he was a starving addict. For her, he knew, it must feel like touching marble. Chloe didn't pull away. She stared down at their joined hands. His, long-fingered and pale, completely covering hers. A strange, protective gesture. A claim. "Jules?" she breathed, her voice barely audible. The sound of his name on her lips, so soft and questioning, broke him. He snatched his hand back as if he'd been burned, the loss of contact a physical blow. He stood up abruptly, the legs of his chair scraping harshly against the floor. "Lesson's over," he said, his voice clipped. "I think you've learned enough for one night." He threw a few bills on the table, more than enough to cover the drinks, and turned to leave before she could see the truth of what this lesson had cost him. He had meant to teach her how to flirt, but all he had done was confess everything without saying a single word. The lessons worked. They worked too well. It was a beautiful, crisp autumn Tuesday when Chloe called him, her voice bubbling with an excitement that felt like a physical blow to Julian's chest. "He asked me out. Jules, a real honest-to-God man asked me. Out on a real honest-to-God date!" Julian was standing in his study, a cavernous room lined with books from floor to ceiling, books he had read in their original languages when they were first written. A sliver of late afternoon sun cut through the tall window, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. He closed his eyes. He had forged the key and taught her how to turn it. He had no right to be surprised when she unlocked a door and walked through it. "Who is he?" he asked, his voice a carefully modulated instrument of calm interest. "His name is Mark," she gushed, and Julian could picture her perfectly, pacing her small, sunny apartment, a phone pressed to her ear, a radiant smile on her face. "We met at the gallery opening on Saturday. I was looking at that weird abstract sculpture, and I said something you taught me about how the artist used negative space to create tension, and he just lit up. He's an architect. He actually understood what I meant. We talked for an hour. He's smart, Jules, and funny, and he has this great smile. An architect, a builder, a man who created things in the light. Julian, by contrast, was a creature of ancient spaces, of things that were hidden and preserved in darkness. The comparison was stark and cruel. "He sounds promising," Julian said, the words feeling like swallowing ground glass. "He is. He's taking me to dinner on Friday, to Aveline." Aveline, of course, the most sought-after reservation in the city, a place of hushed tones, shimmering candlelight, and 3-month waiting lists. A place Julian could have booked with a single, whispered phone call. This Mark, this perfect architect, had managed it on his own. The man was not just equipped, he was armed to the teeth. "That's wonderful, Chloe," he said, and the lie was so profound it felt like a sin. It was a violation of the pure, honest thing he felt for her. "I know, and I'm going to wear the green dress. I'm so nervous. What if I forget everything? What if I spill wine on him? What if I say something stupid? You won't, he said, his voice firm. You are incandescent, Chloe. He will be far too busy being dazzled to notice anything else. Only because you taught me how to shine, she said, her voice soft with gratitude. I couldn't have done this without you. And there it was, the knife, twisted with gratitude. He was the architect of his own misery. He had built her a bridge to another man. The rest of the week was a blur of quiet agony. He tried to lose himself in his work, translating a crumbling Sumerian text, but her face kept appearing on the ancient clay tablets. He walked the city at night, a silent ghost moving through the sleeping streets, but every laughing couple he passed felt like a personal rebuke. The city was full of light and life and love, and he was locked outside of it, a lonely king staring through the glass at a feast he could never join. Friday arrived, as he knew it must. Time, the one thing he had in endless supply, had never felt so much like an enemy. He stood before the full-length mirror in his bedroom, adjusting the knot of his black silk tie. He was dressed in a suit of impossible quality, tailored to his frame with a precision that bordered on supernatural. He looked like a man going to a funeral. His own. His phone chimed. It was Chloe. A picture of her in the emerald dress. She was glowing, her hair swept up, her smile a mixture of excitement and nerves. The caption read, "Wish me luck, coach." Something inside him, some ancient, possessive, territorial thing that had slumbered for 5 years, snapped. The calm he had so carefully cultivated evaporated. The logic, the self-sacrifice, the noble idea of protecting her from himself. It all burned away in a sudden, white-hot blaze of jealousy. The thought of this Mark, this stranger, looking at her in that dress, the dress he had chosen. The thought of him touching her hand, hearing her laugh, getting lost in her whiskey-colored eyes. It was not a thought. It was a violation. He picked up his phone. His fingers flew across the screen, his message blunt, a command, not a request. "I'm coming with you." Her reply was almost immediate. "What? Jules, no, you can't." "I can and I will," he typed back, the words stark and final. "I need to ensure he's suitable, a final assessment. I'll sit at the bar, I'll be discreet, but I will be there." It was madness. It was indefensible. It was the act of a desperate, unraveling man. He was no longer the coach. He was the dragon, woken from its slumber, coming to reclaim its treasure. He looked at his reflection, but it was not the urbane Julian Croft who stared back. For a fleeting second, he saw the truth of himself, the pale skin, the unnatural stillness, and the faint, predatory glow in the depths of his dark eyes. The king was done hiding in the guise of a commoner. The restaurant was even worse than Julian had imagined. It was a masterpiece of understated elegance, all muted tones, soft lighting, and the gentle murmur of quiet conversations. Each table was an intimate island, bathed in the warm, golden glow of a single candle. It was a room designed for romance, for secrets, for the beginning of things. And Julian, a creature of endings, felt hideously out of place. He sat at the long marble bar, a glass of ice water in front of him, his back to the wall. He had a perfect view of their table. He had arrived first, a silent specter in a dark suit, and had watched as Mark, the architect, greeted Chloe. Mark was exactly as Julian had feared. He was handsome in a clean-cut, reliable way. He had kind eyes and an easy smile. He was tall, but not so tall as to make Chloe feel small. He looked at her with an open, honest admiration that made Julian's fists clench under the bar. He was, in a word, perfect. He was everything Julian was not: human, warm, uncomplicated. A man of the sun. Chloe was radiant. The emerald dress shimmered as she moved, catching the candlelight. She was luminous, a splash of vibrant life in the sophisticated, muted room. She was everything he had taught her to be: confident, graceful, captivating. And she was captivating another man. Julian watched them, his senses stretched to an unnatural degree. He could hear their conversation as clearly as if he were sitting with them. Mark was telling her about a building he was designing, a sustainable library with a rooftop garden. His passion was genuine, his words intelligent. Chloe was listening, truly listening, asking insightful questions, her face animated with interest. She laughed, a bright musical sound that lanced Julian straight through the chest. He had to stop this. He closed his eyes for a moment, focusing. He reached out with his mind, a silent, invisible tendril of thought, across the room to their table. He didn't touch Chloe. He would never invade her mind. But Mark was fair game. He found the architect's thoughts easily. They were as well-ordered and pleasant as the man himself. She's incredible. Don't say something stupid. Her eyes are amazing. I hope I don't have spinach in my teeth. Julian pushed. It was a gentle nudge at first, a subtle suggestion planted in the fertile ground of first-date anxiety. The wine, Julian thought, focusing the idea into a single, sharp point. It tastes a little sour, like cork. Mark, who had just taken a sip of the expensive Pinot Noir he'd ordered, paused. He frowned, swirling the wine in his glass. Is this wine okay to you? He asked Chloe. It tastes a little off to me. Chloe took a delicate sip. It tastes fine to me, she said, a little confused. Mark took another drink, his brow furrowed. Maybe it's just me. Julian smiled grimly into his water glass. It was a start. They moved on to their appetizers. Mark was telling a funny story about a construction mishap. Chloe was leaning in, captivated. Julian pushed again, harder this time. You're boring her. This story is going nowhere. She's just being polite. Mark faltered mid-sentence. He lost his train of thought, stammering for a moment. And so, the crane operator, he trailed off, flushing slightly. Sorry, I lost my place. Chloe gave him an encouraging smile. It's okay. You were saying the crane operator mistook the porta-potty for a dumpster? Right, Mark said, but the easy humor had gone out of his expression. He seemed flustered, self-conscious. Julian felt a grim satisfaction. He was a puppeteer, pulling invisible strings, turning this perfect evening into a stilted, awkward mess. It was a cruel, petty act, and he reveled in it. This was his power, the power he had hidden from her for so long. He was a king, and kings did not surrender their treasures gracefully. Throughout the main course, he continued his silent assault. Every time Mark started to build a rhythm, Julian would sow a seed of doubt. She's looking at the man at the bar. Does she know him? Did you just spill that tiny drop of sauce on your tie? She definitely saw that. Your laugh sounds forced. You sound like a donkey. Mark grew increasingly agitated. He fidgeted with his silverware. He kept clearing his throat. He knocked over his water glass, the sound sharp in the quiet room as water bloomed across the white linen tablecloth. A waiter rushed over, mopping up the spill with quiet efficiency, but the damage was done. The easy, confident man who had walked in an hour ago was gone, replaced by a bundle of nerves and insecurity. Chloe was trying her best. She kept the conversation going, her expression a mixture of sympathy and growing confusion. She couldn't understand what was happening, why the charming, intelligent man from the gallery had devolved into this awkward stranger. And then she looked up. Her eyes scanned the room, a faint frown on her face, as if searching for an answer to this bizarre turn of events. Her gaze passed over the bar, and for a split second it met Julian's. In that instant, he let the mask drop. He let her see. He didn't shield his thoughts, his intentions. He let the cold, possessive fury in his eyes blaze across the room. He let her feel the sheer force of his will that was currently focused on dismantling her date. He saw the flicker of recognition in her eyes, the confusion, the dawning horror. Her eyes widened, her face paling. She looked from him to the miserable, flustered Mark, and then back to him. The pieces clicked into place. The sudden downturn of the evening, his bizarre insistence on being here, the intensity of his stare. She knew. She pushed her chair back, the legs scraping softly on the floor. She murmured an apology to Mark, her eyes never leaving Julian's. Then she turned and walked, not ran, toward the bar. Her movements were stiff, controlled, her face a mask of disbelief and betrayal. She stopped in front of him. The entire restaurant, with its candlelight and soft music, seemed to fade into a dull gray background. There was only Chloe, her honey-colored eyes blazing with a fire he had never seen before. "It was you," she said, her voice a low, trembling whisper. "This whole time, it was you." He didn't deny it. He couldn't. He simply met her furious gaze and gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. The king had been caught sabotaging the suitor, and he felt not a shred of remorse. Only the terrifying, exhilarating thrill of the endgame. The ride in his car was a tomb of silence. Julian drove, his hands steady on the leather-wrapped steering wheel, his eyes fixed on the slick, rain-washed streets. The city lights smeared past them, streaks of red and gold in the darkness. He didn't turn on the radio. The only sounds were the rhythmic sweep of the windshield wipers and Chloe's ragged breathing from the passenger seat. She hadn't spoken another word since the confrontation at the bar. She had simply allowed him to settle the bill, murmur a clipped, dismissive apology to the utterly bewildered Mark, and guide her out into the cool night air. He had held the car door for her, and she had gotten in without resistance, moving like an automaton. Now she sat staring out her window, her arms wrapped tightly around herself, a fragile fortress against the man beside her. The emerald dress seemed to mock them with its promise of a perfect evening. He could feel her emotions radiating from her in waves, confusion, betrayal, a deep, trembling fear. But underneath it all, a current of something else, a stunned, horrified recognition, as if the world she had known for 5 years had been a carefully painted backdrop that was now being ripped away to reveal a terrifying, unknown landscape. He didn't drive her home. He bypassed the familiar turn to her small, bright apartment building and guided the powerful, silent car onto the highway, heading north out of the city. "Where are you taking me?" she finally asked, her voice thin and strained, barely a whisper. "To my home," he said, not looking at her. "It's time you saw it." "I've been to your home," she said, a note of defiance in her tone. "Your apartment downtown." "That is not my home," he replied, his voice flat. "That is a stage, a set piece. Where I live is elsewhere." After another 20 minutes of suffocating silence, he turned off the highway onto a dark, unmarked private road. Towering, ancient trees lined the drive, their branches interlocking overhead to form a dense canopy that blocked out the moon and stars. The world outside the car's headlights was absolute blackness. It felt like they were driving into the mouth of the night itself. Finally, the trees opened up, and they emerged into a vast clearing. Ahead of them, perched on a low rise overlooking a dark, placid lake, was a house. House was too small a word. It was an estate. A sprawling structure of dark gray stone and black slate, with turrets and gables that clawed at the night sky. It was Gothic and imposing, a place of shadows and secrets, looking less like it had been built and more like it had grown out of the earth itself. There were no lights on in any of the countless windows. He brought the car to a stop on the gravel drive and cut the engine. The silence that descended was profound, broken only by the distant, lonely cry of a loon from across the lake. He got out and walked around to her side, opening her door. She didn't move, just stared at the monolithic structure before her. "Jules, what is this place?" she whispered, her fear a palpable thing in the cold air. "This is who I am, Chloe," he said softly. He offered her his hand. After a long hesitation, she took it. Her fingers were ice cold. He led her up the stone steps to a pair of massive oak doors. He didn't use a key. He simply rested his palm on the wood, and with a low groan of ancient hinges, the doors swung inward, opening into a darkness that seemed to swallow the light from the outside world. He guided her into a cavernous great hall. The air inside was cool and still, carrying the scent of old stone, beeswax, and something else. Something metallic and faintly wild. The ceiling soared 2 stories high into shadow. Moonlight streamed through a massive arched window at the far end of the hall, illuminating a floor of polished black marble and the ghostly shapes of shrouded furniture. He released her hand and walked to the center of the room, into the single beam of moonlight. He turned to face her. She stood silhouetted in the doorway, a small, vibrant figure against the backdrop of the wild, living night. "You have questions," he said. It wasn't a question. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice trembling but clear. "What are you?" "I am the man who has loved you since the first day we met," he began, the truth of it raw and absolute. "I am the man who sabotaged your date tonight, because the thought of another man's hands on you, another man's eyes on you, is a madness I cannot bear." He took a slow breath, though he had no need of air. "And I am a liar. Julian Croft is a fiction, a ghost I created so I could stand in your light without burning." This was it, the precipice he had stood on for 5 years. He closed his eyes and let it all fall away, the carefully maintained glamour, the illusion of warm skin and steady breathing, the entire construct of his humanity. He let it dissolve like smoke. When he opened his eyes again, they were no longer the dark, familiar brown she knew. They glowed with a soft, internal silver light, luminous and predatory in the darkness. He felt the old, familiar ache in his jaw as his canines sharpened, lengthening just enough to press against his lower lip. The man she knew was gone, and in his place stood something older, colder, and far more dangerous. The king, in his own court, had finally dropped his disguise. Chloe's breath hitched in a tiny, sharp gasp. Her hand flew to her mouth, but she didn't scream. She didn't run. She just stared, her wide, terrified eyes reflecting the silver light of his. "I brought you here to give you a choice," he said, his voice deeper now, resonant with an ancient power that echoed in the vast, silent hall. "A choice I should have given you years ago, but I was a coward. I was afraid of what you would choose. I was afraid of losing you." He took a step toward her, his movements fluid and unnaturally silent on the marble floor. "You can leave. I will take you home, and I will erase tonight from your memory. I will erase the lessons, the date, this house. I will even erase myself from your life, if that is what it takes to keep you safe. You can go back to your world, to the sun, and find a good, human man, and forget any of this ever happened. I will give you that. It will be my final gift to you." He paused, stopping a few feet away from her, close enough that she could see the truth of him in the moonlight, but far enough to give her space. "Or," he said, his voice dropping to a raw, vulnerable whisper that held the weight of centuries of loneliness, "you can stay. You can choose this. Choose me. The real me. All of me." It is a world of shadows and secrets, Chloe. It is dangerous, and it is eternal. But I swear to you, In that world, you will never be unloved. You will never be alone. You will be its queen. My queen. You will have a devotion so absolute it will beggar belief. He held his breath, a useless human habit he had never managed to break. He stood before her, utterly exposed, his power and his monstrosity laid bare. But it was his heart, the phantom heart he still felt ache for her, that he had truly placed at her feet. He had given her all the power. The choice was hers. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, filled with the frantic, terrified, beautiful beating of her human heart. Chloe stood frozen in the monumental doorway, the cool night air at her back, and the impossible truth standing before her in a column of moonlight. Her mind was a maelstrom, a chaotic whirl of images and sensations. Julian at the bar, his eyes burning with cold fire. Julian in the fitting room, his touch sending shivers down her spine. Julian in the ballroom, his hold both gentle and unbreakable, his eyes promising a world of unspoken things as he dipped her low. The watch. Tempus neminem manet. Time waits for no one. The casual way he'd said he never seemed to age. It wasn't just tonight. It was 5 years of small, inexplicable moments, of an intensity she had always misinterpreted as quiet friendship, of a protectiveness that went far beyond platonic affection. It was the way he always seemed to appear when she was in trouble, the way he looked at her when he thought she wasn't watching, the strange, old-world formality that clung to him like a second skin. All the disparate, confusing pieces of the man she knew as Julian Croft were suddenly, terrifyingly, slotting into place. His eyes. She couldn't look away from his eyes. They were no longer the warm, dark pools she knew. They were twin moons, glowing with a soft, silver light that was both beautiful and deeply unnerving. They held an ancient sadness, a loneliness so profound it felt like a physical cold in the room. And in their depths, she saw his confession, a desperate, consuming love that was more real and more powerful than anything she had ever encountered. Her fear was a living thing, a frantic bird beating its wings against her ribs. Every instinct screamed at her to turn, to flee back into the familiar world of streetlights and coffee shops and men who were just men. The first choice he offered was safety, normalcy, a life untouched by this beautiful, terrifying darkness. He would erase it all. She could wake up tomorrow and her biggest problem would be what to have for breakfast. The thought was a lifeline, a promise of escape. But what would she be escaping to? The wasteland she had complained about just weeks ago? A string of perfectly nice, perfectly normal marks, none of whom would ever look at her with the raw, soul-bearing adoration she saw in Julian's glowing eyes right now. He would erase himself. The thought was not a relief. It was a visceral, horrifying loss. A life without Julian, without his quiet presence, his dry wit, his unwavering support, his love, was not a life she wanted. It was a gray, colorless existence. He had said he taught her how to sunshine, but the truth was, she had only ever felt truly incandescent when she was with him. He had lied to her. He had manipulated her date. He was possessive and controlling and dangerous. He was not human. He was a monster from a fairy tale, a king of shadows. And he loved her. He loved her enough to let her go. He loved her enough to erase himself from her world to keep her safe. The magnitude of that sacrifice, the sheer self-abnegating love it represented, was more powerful than her fear. This creature of the night, this ancient, powerful being, was making himself vulnerable to her. He was giving a mortal woman power over his immortal heart. The fear was still there, but something else was rising to meet it. Courage. A fierce, defiant pulse of certainty. Her life had always felt like a prelude, a story waiting for its real beginning. She looked at him, truly looked at him, past the fangs and the glowing eyes, and saw the man she had known all along. The man who brought her soup when she was sick and listened to her for hours. Only now he was stripped of his disguise. He wasn't a monster. He was Julian. Her Julian. She took a breath, the cold air filling her lungs, and she took a step. Not backward, toward the safety of the night, but forward, into the shadowed hall, onto the cold marble floor. She saw the flicker of shock in his silver eyes, the subtle tensing of his frame. He hadn't expected this. He had expected her to run. She took another step, and another. The sound of her sensible, human shoes on the ancient stone floor was a declaration. She walked out of the world she knew and into his. She didn't stop until she was standing directly in front of him, so close she had to tilt her head back to meet his gaze. She could feel the chill radiating from his body, a stark contrast to the living warmth of her own. She could see the intricate, otherworldly silver patterns in his irises. She could see the sharp, white tip of a fang against his lower lip. He was terrifying. He was beautiful. He was hers. "You're an idiot," she whispered, her voice shaking but strong. A flicker of confusion crossed his regal features. I don't understand." "You think I would choose a normal life over you?" she asked, a wetness gathering in her eyes. "You think I could ever forget you, even if you made me?" She raised a trembling hand, not to strike him, not to push him away, but to touch him. She laid her palm gently against his cheek. His skin was impossibly smooth and as cold as the marble beneath her feet. He flinched at her touch, as if he expected to be burned, then leaned into it, his silver eyes closing in something that looked like painful relief. "Chloe," he breathed, her name a prayer on his lips. "You said a king doesn't surrender his treasure," she said, her voice growing stronger, surer. "Well, I'm not treasure to be won or lost. I'm a queen, and a queen chooses her own king." With those words, she stood on her toes, wrapped her arms around his neck, and pulled his face down to hers. She closed the final distance between them, pressing her warm, living lips against his cold, perfect ones. For a moment, he was utterly still, a statue of shock and disbelief. Then, with a low sound from deep in his chest, a sound of anguish and ecstasy and 1,000 years of solitude finally breaking, he responded. His arms came around her, pulling her flush against his body, lifting her off her feet. His embrace was not gentle. It was desperate, possessive, a drowning man clinging to his only salvation. He kissed her back with a hunger that spoke of famine, of centuries of watching and wanting and denying. It was a kiss of two worlds colliding, of shadow and light, of mortality and eternity. It was the end of a long, lonely chapter, and the beginning of a new, terrifying, magnificent story. As he held her there, suspended in the single beam of moonlight in the heart of his ancient, silent home, Chloe knew she had made her choice. She had stepped out of the sun and into his arms, and for the first time in her life, she was exactly where she was supposed to be.